Hi guys, Geekonomics here, and what I'd like to do today is to go over the market failure diagram for the transport economics paper tomorrow on Friday the 19th of June with regard to how one would attempt to cure a market failure in the transport industry, particularly where it's to do with the overconsumption of petrol or car use or whatever it may be. So we've got our standard diagram here. We've got the price, we've got quantity, and we've got our demand curve here, which we're labelling up this time as the marginal social benefit. We've got a marginal private cost curve, and we've got a marginal social cost curve. If I were a firm, or if I were an individual consuming petrol, I am not particularly interested in, and I'm just giving you this by way of theory, this is the way the theory goes, but I am only interested in myself. I am selfish in that respect. And consequently, my equilibrium level of consumption and consequently the equilibrium level of output arises at the intersection of my private costs and the social benefit curve, the demand curve, which is here. So we're at Q1 and P1. Now, on last year's paper, one of the things that candidates didn't do very well was that they didn't explain why things were market failures. So why is this a market failure? It's a market failure because we are having over consumption, in this case of car usage or whatever it may be. So Q1 is much too high, and the price that I'm having to pay is much too low. So we need to get me to pay for that. We need to internalize the externality, internalize the damage that I'm doing to society by making me pay for it. Now if I pay for it, I am then taking into consideration not only my own private costs, but I'm also taking into consideration the damage I'm doing to society, which is known as the social costs. And so as a consequence of that, really, I want the level of output to be at Q star and the price level to be at P star. So I want to raise prices and reduce the quantity demanded. And in that way, we can help to cure this market failure because we will reduce the consumption and hence the damage to society, etc., etc. So how do we do it? We introduce one method of doing it, and there are lots that you've got to consider in your specification, but one of them is to introduce a tax. Now this type of tax is known as a Pigovian tax, P-I-G-O-V-I-A-N, after the very famous economist Piaget, and you can introduce a Pigovian tax. As you know from your AS studies, if you introduce a tax, it raises a firm's costs of production, shown on a supply curve, and so the supply curve would go upwards to S plus tax. So similarly, if we could introduce a tax here to the marginal private cost, we would end up at the marginal social cost, where that would be equal to the MPC plus the tax. And the tax would have to be covering what's known as the MEC, which is the marginal external cost or the damage that we are doing to society. The cost implications in terms of the size of the tax would be obviously from here to here. And the vertical distance, well, they're parallel lines, so you could take it anywhere, but generally speaking, this is what we'd use. So the vertical distance between those two supply curves, that is going to be the size of the Pigovian tax required in order to reduce the level of this negative externality, to reduce consumption back to the more allocatively efficient level. It's sometimes, some textbooks refer to it as the socially desirable level. And in so doing, we're helping to cure this market failure. You should also be aware that this, so if you take a dashed line up to here, so we've got A, B and C. This is what would be referred to as this triangle, the deadweight loss and the social cost. So the cost imposed on society as a consequence of the overconsumption of whatever it may be, car travel or whatever. And again, that's something worth highlighting on a diagram should you be asked to consider this in the exam. Now, that's how you cure it, but of course you might then have to come up with all sorts of evaluative statements about this. Again, the key thing with the evaluative statements is, don't just briefly say, oh, it depends, we may not introduce the correct size of the tax. So if the tax wasn't the right, say the tax was too much, and so you might shift the supply curve way up here, and so consumption drops off massively to a much too great extent than you would actually desire. Don't just say, oh, it depends on the size. You've got to elaborate on your evaluative statements. Do remember to do that. You can also see that the marginal social benefit curve here is fairly elastic, but of course, as you know, the marginal social benefit curve for these types of things would tend to be very inelastic, and there are all sorts of comments which one could make with regard to the relative price elasticity of demand, be it elastic or inelastic. We're trying to, I remember in the paper last year, they like you, and the exam board like you to talk about modal switches. So you're trying to get people to switch their mode of transport, so to move from their cars to buses or whatever. Don't forget to use terms like hypothecation, whereby any tax which is raised in this area of transport can be used for other transport projects. And I think that's really all I wanted to say on that one.